All right. Hey, Nolan. Good to be with you, man.
Hey, Jerry. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
My absolute pleasure. So, I am here with Nolan Grey, the author of Arbitrary Lines: How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. I can honestly say that in 2022, this was probably the most interesting book on development of cities, communities, built space, land use in the U.S. that I read. I actually ran out and I bought it for the entire leadership team at Regrid. I thought it was so good, and I thought it was so helpful in thinking through land use, development, building, construction, all these things that kind of interface with the surface of the country. So I'm really excited to talk with you, Nolan.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm fascinated by the work that you all do, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
There's a nice intersection between land parcels and zoning, of course. These kind of restrictions on what you can and can't do with land. As a fan of the book too, I just love the way you put the story together. I felt like, for a topic that could be as dry as some might think, it's really not. I mean, it's sort of a history of intrigue and the decisions that contribute to how you and I live in our neighborhoods and in cities today. It's got lots of characters. It's got twists and turns. And you do a great job jumping back and forth between deep history and present day. And then also, mercifully, I feel like you don't wait a long time to present some like proposed solutions for how we could do zoning and land use better. I'm kind of used to get to the last 5 pages and then there's something half baked, and that was not the case.
Yeah. No, that's there's this impulse, especially in academic writing, to have, like, oh, we'll talk about solutions in the conclusion, and that, no, I think the bread and butter. I mean, the explaining what zoning is and where it comes from and the issues, like, that was all stuff that kind of existed out in the ether, right? You could find it. I think there's still some value in pulling it together, but no, yeah, I mean, this is the purpose of writing the book, is to change the world, right? So, well, hopefully that last section does it.
Amen on that. So could you start, like, give us like your thesis, like what motivated you to write the book, and then like what's the main thesis so people get that takeaway?
Yeah, so I think the reason to write the book is that I think we're really living through a big moment right now, where a lot of folks are actually rethinking in fundamental ways the way we plan and manage our cities, right? Um, you know, this wasn't the case everywhere before the pandemic, but it certainly is the case now. Housing affordability crisis has gone national. Like, places that historically didn't have any issues with housing affordability are absorbing a lot of folks who are priced out of places like California and New York. States like Florida, Utah, Arizona. I was just in Montana, and they're, of course, dealing with a housing crisis. So you have people thinking about housing in a very serious way, housing affordability. Folks thinking about racial and socioeconomic equity, right? Why are our cities so segregated? Why do they remain segregated? Why are Americans moving en masse from some of our most productive places? Places like the Bay Area are currently losing population, right? It's one of our richest and most productive regions. That's a puzzle that we need to explain. Then, of course, just the environmental and sustainability considerations, right? Many folks want to live in walkable communities. They want to live in communities served by transit. Not everybody, but a large portion of the population does, and we don't really provide communities like that. We don't build communities like that. We're sort of just riding on the fumes of neighborhoods like that that were built before zoning. And so, folks were contending with all these different issues, and really zoning would, come up in these conversations. But as a trained and former practicing city planner, I would always find, people maybe only had a very vague idea of what zoning was, right? Or maybe even somebody who had the right sort of policy views on what needed to change with zoning would say something that suggested to me that, oh, this person doesn't really understand zoning. And there wasn't any sort of text I could send people to, right? Like, I've mentioned this a couple times, but I would literally direct people to go read like Zoning for Dummies, or like, a developer handbook on zoning. And, that's not exactly the type of material that'll whet someone's appetite to learn more about the subject. So, to cover it, I wanted to sort of explain what zoning was, situate it among all of those different policy issues that people were thinking about, and then try to set out an actual, framework for reform or dramatically overhauling the system. So, we can talk about all that.
Okay, small stuff. So can you do tell too, just in the nutshell, because I do find because I would put myself in that category of people who, prior to reading the book, was like, yeah, I know what zoning is. It's you can and can't do stuff, and there's like this SimCity kind of element. Can you kind of share like the tweet link just to kind of reduce the morass of various planning-y, land usey things of what's the fortune cookie of what fits into zoning real quick?
Sure. So zoning is a subset of city planning, what it's doing is it's taking every single parcel in a city and saying for each one of those parcels, here are the permitted land uses that you can build on that parcel. And here is the density or the amount of floor area at which you can build. And these rules are generally extremely prescriptive. And when you understand them, you actually can walk around or drive around your city and understand in large part why it looks the way it does.
Can't build higher than this, can't build too close to the curb, can't build too close to the building next to you, and must have a general residential or commercial kind of a purpose.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like, part of the challenge of writing the book is that, like, the US is also unique in that every single local government writes its own zoning code. So it's kind of hard to generalize. So I think I actually have a footnote where I'm like apologizing for all the hedge words, like mostly, generally, typically, right? But zoning varies pretty dramatically city to city. And of course, that's, as I talk about in the book, that's one of the issues with our system.
So let's go there for a second then, because one of the things, like when I was trying to like distill to my colleagues, like what were some of the most memorable things that I took away from the book, I would say to me, and you can correct and add onto these, please. But so one thing I wasn't aware of is that zoning, as we know it today, is really only about 100 years old, right? It's a tick over 100 years old, but it started slowly, and then before it went everywhere. So first off, the fact that it wasn't that old. Obviously, there was life before it here, and there's life during it, in different ways in other places. And then one thing that resonated with me, and this would be fun to hear more detail on too, because it made me think about some mistakes that I'd seen happen in like federal, funding history, particularly coming out of Detroit being like the first place that really opened my eyes about like the importance of land and land ownership and stuff. Was sort of like a huge victim, where the Black population of Detroit was a huge victim of racist federal housing authority administration mortgage programs, where like part of who would get a mortgage and who wouldn't, or where you could get a mortgage, had to do with the racial composition of the place. And so it wasn't just if you were Black, but if you lived in racial composition, get money to construct and build and sell and underwrite homes. And so what you saw was this vast sprawl into the suburbs of these all white communities where you could build stuff. And one of the things that stood out to me in your history, maybe you can add some more detail on this, please, is zoning started in a few communities, and then as it caught on, however it caught on over time, at some point the federal government was like, yeah, if you guys want funding for certain things, like your community needs to have zoning. And so people were like, oh, okay, like we'll all get zoning. And that stood out to me because I was like, wow, that's what kind of makes the history like important. It's like it didn't have to happen the way that it did, right? And by kind of like peeling those pieces back, it might have something to say about how and why it could change, or why there's a case for it changing. So could you talk about some of that foundational history a bit?
No, totally. I think you're touching on two myths that actually really bugged me, that motivated me to write the book, right? So the first is, I think, there's this word exclusionary zoning, and it's essentially trying to denote like elements of zoning that are explicitly trying to segregate cities on the basis of race or socioeconomic class. And it's a powerful sort of rhetorical device. It gets exclusionary in there. It makes it clear, like, hey, a lot of what zoning is perpetuating segregation. But I also kind of hate the term, right? Because like zoning, like there's not so much an exclusionary variety of zoning as there is. That's what zoning exists to do, right? And if you look at the early history of zoning, in many cases, like segregationist objectives were the main sort of underwriting goal, right? Like that's, you read New York City 1916 and like they're complaining about like poor factory workers coming into a posh shopping district, right? Like that's the like use mixing that they're concerned about, not like heavy industry coming into a residential area. And it's the same, of course, in the Berkeley context, which I also talk about, right? Like they're explicitly saying like, hey, poor people and Asian Americans are moving into our community. We need to adopt this code now, and that'll block that from happening. And it's funny because, we get this like, I think we get like a little bit of a sanitized, version of zoning history of like, well, we needed zoning because we needed to keep heavy industry out of residential neighborhoods, or we needed zoning because we needed to be able to like make sure that we had sufficient, stormwater or water infrastructure for new development. And, like those are on the margins of what zoning's dealing with. But if you really look at a lot of these actual zoning conversations, the aspiration to segregate cities is almost constantly very central, right? And it strikes me as not an accident that you get this wave of zoning adoption almost immediately after Buchanan v. Worley, which was when the Supreme Court said to cities, no, sorry, you can't do explicit South Africa style zoning, right? So this was this had to do with like Louisville, my home state of Kentucky, which said like, whites can't live on black majority blocks and vice versa. So it's race neutral, right? Separate but equal. Of course, in a rare moment of clarity on this stuff, Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to buy that. But then what you get in the aftermath of racial zoning, explicitly racial zoning being rendered unconstitutional, is a whole bunch of cities go out and adopt these codes. So that's the first, I think, myth that, I wanted to touch on. But the second one has to do with, I think there's this myth of like zoning was this popular bottom up thing, right? Like there was this wave of reform energy and people went out and demanded zoning of their local governments. And, I don't doubt that was true in certain pockets, but as you were getting at, there was a huge federal push behind this, right? Federal government the Department of Commerce writes the Standard Zoning Enabling Act and mails it out to every state and says, hey, this is something you should adopt. And then for decades after that, as the federal government plays a much more larger role in funding state and local infrastructure, they start putting these conditions to say, hey, like you need to adopt a zoning code regardless of whether or not you want to. I was just in Montana, and a lot of these towns actually adopted zoning in the 1960s, not because they actually needed it to deal with any growth pressures or any sort of undesirable use mixing, but because the federal government said, if you want to be eligible for this big giant pot of money, we want to see you adopt a zoning code that does all this typical stuff, segregating the city and sort of privileging detached single family homes.
So I just think that's fascinating. So just like, repeating on that. So like, not terribly old in the grand scheme. Neither is America, by the way, but it's older than 100 years old. So it's fairly late to the game. And then a couple of those decisions that you mentioned, one, the barring of explicit racial segregation may have had a factor in making the segregation of land use perhaps more appetizing for those who wanted to achieve a similar end without a human component to it. And then secondly, the funding piece. I feel like both of those are so large systematically, and they're so interesting to understand, because I feel like that's the power of historical context, is you start to tease these things apart, and it makes you wonder if something's the right thing to keep doing in the future, or if you just kind of got there through an accident that you're not that proud of. Could make it easier to think about changing. I don't know. That's
well, and on this point too, right? Like we've inherited this system that was trying to do all these things that we actually would generally undermine your typical contemporary city's planning objectives, right? Like it undermines housing affordability, it undermines integration and equity, it undermines, allowing for more compact patterns of development. But then we can't really get rid of this thing because it's been sort of slotted into a whole bunch of other land use planning sort of processes, right? And I think that's where it's like, when I'm writing the book, I'm like, I think we need a really fundamental rethink, right? Like we can tinker with the system all day, but I think, it's a fundamental rethink of the system is overdue.
Okay. So there's something about the time that we're in that you think calls for this. And this is kind of like, maybe this is naive, but I think I'm sensing something real with this. Like, I'll go back to what I said a minute ago. America's not like that old, but like it's getting older, right? It was like this kind of newer kid on the block for a while that was doing all these like miraculous, weird things that nobody had ever done before, and a greater diversity of people, and just everything was like bigger, and just like, whoa, did you see what they did over in the US? Like, but now you kind of look around, and like the way that I would put it is that we're old enough where like almost every single city and settlement and community in the US has outlived its original reason for being. Okay, so I'll even go, like, I'll use Detroit again as an example because it's often on my mind. But you think about where Detroit is geographically, on a river connecting the Great Lakes. They call it the Midwest, but in my mind, it's kind of the expanded like East Coast. It's just part of this. Like it's people are surprised it's in the Eastern time zone when they're not familiar with Michigan. They're like, what? Like it is. And because of its geographical advantages, and it was before cars, it was like big at shipbuilding and like freighting, and you had all these people coming for these things, and it wasn't a far cry to like, and you got the motor and the engine to put your ships and boats, on wheels and kind of send them flying around. You had all these people come there to do this stuff, and then when the need for that went away, because other places started doing it, and there just wasn't the need for that kind of concentration. That's what I would call a community that outlived its original
Hmm.
purpose. And when that happens and you get population changes, you need to redevelop the physical landscape. And I can tell you, and anybody familiar with Detroit will be familiar with the comedy at times. It's a tragic comedy, but just you talk about like zoning, and you'll have a neighborhood that maybe has like 15% of the houses it used to have on it, but somehow you're straitjacketed by this idea of zoning, where it's like, what do you mean we can't have a coffee shop here? It's like all the neighbors agree, and this is not the residential place that it once was. And so we kind of have this situation writ large, where people have moved, where jobs have moved. So is that part of the moment of why it's like ripe to think about this stuff, or are there other factors that tie into why now is a moment for thinking about reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like a deeper critique of the project of trying to assign appropriate uses and densities to every single parcel, right?
Yeah.
Is that like healthy cities have to grow and evolve in kind of unplanned ways, right? And as I argue in the book, of course, you have to have guardrails around that. You need to say you need to deal with things like traditional nuisances or actual land uses that have impacts on neighbors. To my mind, that's totally the appropriate thing to be regulating for. And to the extent that zoning doesn't do that, I actually think there's like we're kind of failing our cities. But you're exactly right. I mean, and I go to so many. I think people tend to think of this as like a problem for maybe superstar cities, right? Like they think, oh yeah, zoning's a problem in New York and San Francisco and LA where it's stopping housing from being built. But I'll tell you, I go to so many small towns where maybe they have a main street that's 50% vacant, and I crack open their zoning code, and they've adopted some weird zoning that says like, well, you need to have a parking space per 250 square feet, and like you can only have like these 5 uses, otherwise you need to apply for a variance or a special permit or da 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 da. And it's like, well, I look at your main street and I'm like, it's not actually legal to use any of these buildings for any land use that might actually want to move into them. Like you would have to demolish it and turn half of the lot into a parking lot. And then cities wonder like, oh well, why is nobody coming back downtown? Why is nobody rehabbing these buildings? Well, because it's actually so much harder to do that than to just go out and build new greenfield, right? Like that's another just funky thing about zoning is we make it hard to actually have cities grow and adapt and to build infill, but we make it very easy if you want to go out on the periphery and build a new subdivision. Again, this is just where I think like the system we've inherited is just completely at odds with what we actually need city planning to do.
So tell me about this, like the national appetite for reform, because I have a tough time in like the chair that I'm sitting in, like if it feels very zeitgeisty to me right now, that I could see a lot of even if it had been slow to change prior, there does feel like there's a moment. Like so many things in the world are changing right now, and people are kind of getting it. Like we got to change. Like what is the appetite that you see? Like or when people encounter your book or these thoughts. When I say people, I mean like whoever has an influence in actual zoning policy. Is the trend like we don't really have to do it this way? Like is that actually catching on, and at what levels is it catching on?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, so I've been on a book tour for the past 6 months or so, and I try to take breaks, but I've been traveling almost every single week since June or July when the book came out, and it's kind of funny because everywhere I go, I'm usually hosted by YIMBY groups or sympathetic local organizers or elected officials, and they all sort of feel like they're sort of in the wilderness. They're like oh like we're having these problems, but like this stuff is never going to pass here, or like they're wondering like, are we ever going to have like the type of sort of sway over policy discussions that are happening in California, and there's like a lot of self-doubt. And it's funny because I see all these groups and I'm like, oh, you are like where Yimbys in California were 2 or 3 years ago, right? Just keep organizing, keep pushing, like almost everywhere you go now, the top issue that voters will raise is cost of living, housing, homelessness, of course, is becoming a much deeper issue. These are, how I think housing and certainly city planning have always been sort of like fringe, less sexy issues, right? Didn't get the type of attention that maybe education or, immigration or these things that we love to argue about would get. But it's actually one of these things that like affects people in a really, really deep way. And I think what's happened over the last few years, and it started in California, but it's now spreading to the rest of the country, is a lot of, young working and middle class people who historically didn't have a problem actually getting access to a decent home and getting on the ladder of building wealth and
Sure.
having some housing stability. They've now found themselves in a situation where it's like, oh, I have no path to homeownership, or at least not in the type of neighborhood where I can live my life the way I want to. And so like these crises, like these little smaller, varying degrees, these crises are sort of spreading everywhere. And yeah, I think there's a unique moment, and I've found the reception great. Of course, some interest groups, right, with a stake in the status quo or push back. But I've talked to planning groups, I've talked to developer groups, I've talked to nonprofit affordable housing developers. I think there's an enormous appetite for reform right now, and we're to a point where it's like the emperor has no clothes, right? Like everybody can no longer just ignore that the system we have today is getting the goods. So I everywhere I go, I just try to be the little Johnny Appleseed and encourage people, like, no, keep pushing. Like you're onto something, and this is actually like this is like a space where we can actually do some positive reform in the next couple of years.
This might sound like a bizarre thought, but I'll just share this with you because I thought this was interesting. I was randomly discussing some colleagues. We were doing some hiring, and it came up like different people's policies towards like non-competes in work agreements. And I'm not a fan. Like I don't ask employees to sign non-competes. I know some states have different rules on them. They're just kind of weird because they seem like they put somebody into an indentured state in a just a bizarre way. And after this conversation, this was just like 2 weeks ago, there was a New York Times piece about how the Federal Trade Commission, and forgive me, I don't know how these laws change and how this is moving through the system, but they put forward a proposal for a ban on non-compete agreements. And in the proposal, they had all these numbers about like, we feel like salaries are being depressed by X number of billions or like whatever it was. We feel like this amount of economic productivity is being lost. And it struck me as like a pretty big political move to see. It was like, what? Okay, like where's that coming from? But for some reason, it connected the dot with like zoning in my head too. And I was like, zoning is kind of like a non-compete agreement for land use, and like everything that I'm like what Nolan's saying and like what I'm reading about this is like you could probably quantify like similar numbers of like whether it's tax revenue or whether it's like some advantages of having people in housing. It just struck me as like one of these big political moves I didn't expect, policy moves I didn't see to come across the bow. And like I mentioned that as maybe like a thing to not that it's like fully comparable, but I was like, it just made me feel like I could almost imagine zoning showing up in that headline is what I'm getting into at some point, where it's like we're not doing this kind of strict zoning anymore because what's happening is that we can't build the kinds of mixed use communities and the kinds of places where people can afford to live. So figure it out differently. So in some weird way, it gave me like, I could just imagine a superimposition of those things. But
no, yeah, I mean, you want to talk about, this is something that doesn't get a lot of play, but I think the economic opportunity piece is really, really important, right? I mean, I'm from, like I said earlier, I'm from Kentucky, and for a lot of folks in a place like Eastern Kentucky, opportunity for them is going to look like moving to a prosperous, productive place, right? Where you have lots of good jobs. And, Americans historically would move to places based on where the jobs were. They could, Americans were highly mobile, right? I mean, that's been a crazy trend that's happened over the last few decades is Americans just move less and less. And then when they do move, they actually move from high productivity regions to low productivity regions. Of course, that, they're doing that not because they like taking a pay cut, but they're doing it because the savings and housing costs alone just totally swamp the dramatic reductions that they're going to face in potential incomes and economic opportunity. Of course, in the aggregate, that makes us collectively just poorer and less innovative as a result. If folks can't move to the place where they can be most productive, right? Like if a young tech worker can't at least go spend a couple years in San Francisco and then come back, or somebody in finance can't move to a place like New York, or a medical researcher can't move to a place like Boston. This mobility, in the same way that, right, like we were just talking about earlier, cities need to be able to change and adapt organically, and they need a lot of flexibility for what you can and can't do on any given lot. We need to maintain this flexibility of like, hey, yeah, if you don't like a job, you can go work for a competitor, right? And that's okay. And or if you're not able to find the type of work that you want to do in the community you're currently in, that it's very easy for you to move. And all these things that we do that just sort of lock people in place and sort of sap, I think this sort of very entrepreneurial part of American culture, I think is a really sad thing. I mean, my own family history, and this is the case for many people, right? Like key moments are when family said, hey, let's move to this place. Let's take a big risk. Let's move here and try to find some opportunity. That's the heart of the American story. And to the extent that we're stopping that up by making it, housing prices in many parts of the country just totally untenable, and forcing working and middle class people to move in, a small number of cities that are for now affordable. I think it's a shame. So, there are all these knock-on effects too that I think that we can go into.
Well, that was one, because that was one I did note that in the book, because it's you do talk a lot about how the inability to find affordable housing in economically prosperous cities leads to this challenge that you're saying. Like for you as the person who might move there, you don't really get a chance to participate in that more prosperous economy, right? So you kind of seek out, call them what you will, right? People have different names that all sound kind of vaguely pejorative to me, but like, your second tier cities and your other kinds of places. I'm a bit of a weirdo personally, because I grew up in New Jersey, and I did, do my kind of like tour of duty. I lived in New York for a few years, and in San Francisco and Los Angeles. But where I gravitated to eventually was Detroit in 2009, which was not a city that anybody, economically rational told me that I should go to at that point in time. It was sort of like I was curious about it. I really liked the vibe, and I sensed a different kind of opportunity, in education there. And then after Detroit, my wife and I moved up to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, in a former booming copper mining town that has not been booming for, coming up on a century right now. And one of the things, I'm curious to get your thought on this too, because I also very much, I do appreciate this trend. I think you can call it a trend, of some people going to smaller cities or rural areas when they're still personally being competitive with themselves. Do you know what I mean? To like, because I'm not trying to not be the best at what I do. You know what I mean? But also, like, I found a way to be in locations that are not known for being like the traditional best, right? You want to start the best tech and data company for something. You don't necessarily think Detroit. You probably certainly don't think, Calumet, Michigan on stuff. So I'm curious how, like, zoning might affect, both scenarios in a good way. So one, certainly if I wanted to go to San Francisco with my family and be there, would love to plug into something more affordable. I'm also curious, like, do you have any more thoughts on like how these, softening of zoning and like, infilling downtowns with different kinds of construction in smaller places can be helpful there too? Because last thing I'll say, and just a hunch, like, how divided we are as a country right now politically on stuff. It's like people don't even speak the same language sometimes, and broadly, a lot of this stuff does feel like urban, suburban, rural kind of divide. So I'm just curious if you have any riffs or thoughts on like how zoning, so you want to be able to be in that big city affordably, but like what's the cool stuff that can happen to make some currently less attractive places more attractive?
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I mean, my general thinking, I'll say this, right? I gave a talk in Reno, and making the case for zoning liberalization in Reno, and that this would help with the affordable housing crisis that they were dealing with. And the pushback I got was, this is all a function of Californians moving here. And, if only we could, if that's our problem, and we just need to deal with that problem. And, it's not on us to liberalize or anything, And I said, look, yeah, I mean, for sure, like, we need to deal with the affordable housing crisis in a place like California, so that nobody who is forced to move away and they really don't want to, right? I mean, that's, but a place like Reno is nice. Like, much of the country is actually really nice. Folks are going to keep moving around. Places are going to keep growing. Cities that historically have had a bad run are going to recover eventually, right? And then the question is, like, how do you make sure that growth can happen in a way that continues to lift all boats and is not this zero-sum game, right? I mean, that's I think what goes on with gentrification is you have, folks who want to move back into a community, maybe an inner suburb or an urban neighborhood. But if we have a, stagnant housing supply, or if it's illegal to actually build more of those types of neighborhoods, or it's illegal to build infill in those types of neighborhoods, then you basically just have people playing musical chairs, right? And, the folks who lose in that game are the most, folks who are lower income or generally marginalized. And so how do you solve that problem, right? Like, you just build more and grant that flexibility, right? And that's like, and this is as true too, to talk about Detroit, right? It fascinates me that I look at a place like Detroit, and, of course, you want people to be coming there and running experiments and trying new things and pursuing paths of, types of development that will bring people back into the city and that will sort of resuscitate parts of the economy. But then you have this thicket of rules, exactly like you said, like, oh, well, we're going to be extremely prescriptive about what you can and can't do where. And I find that very bizarre, right? That's the element of zoning where it's like, this is not just like a San Francisco or New York thing. This is a thing for any city that wants to be dynamic and growing and equitable and healthy.
I will say too, this is a I don't want to be careful how I say it, but I want to say carefully for those, who don't know whether or not I have this context. But like in my experience in Detroit, some of the more interesting times in the last 15 years have been sort of at the nadir. I think that's the fancy word for the low point, right? Opposed to the zenith of when there was enforcement for what people were doing with spaces and land, and there was a real flourishing of urban farms and really funky adaptive reuses. And there was a sort of like just kind of an encouraging head nod, from city officials at times, just to be like, go get her done, man. And then as things have formalized more, I would say over the last 5 or 6 years, to where, it's like, okay, now we're back on top of stuff. I've been concerned that some of those experiments have been going away, as there's now like no way in heck you can like, build something significant without going through every, hoop and hurdle. And even some of you talked about this some too, maybe this is something to riff on, of like why you've sort of, make the case for getting rid of zoning, not getting rid of caring about the big concerns for what's actually a nuisance, but not light reforms. I remember some years back, like the big innovation that popped up in Detroit is that they were going to try like pink zoning, I think was the term. I'm not sure if pink zoning makes sense to you. I barely, I read the back of the box, and it was like, basically it was like, as I recall, it was like pink zoning, we can like try a little bit, but not too hard, or something like that. It was, these were like zones where you could like maybe make it work for a second. And it kind of struck me, it was just an interesting half measure. I'm not sure if that's something to riff on there, of like, why you advocate for, much wider loosening than some of these small, like, you can build it 5 feet closer to the curb now, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to just my deeper theory of what we want land use planning to do, right? As I have a section of the book where I steel man zoning, right? We were talking about before we started recording.
I love it. I'm just going to say for the listeners, this was another thing I really appreciate about the book was just while Nolan has a point of view for sure, it's very respectful to the higher ideals and intentions of the best cases of zoning. And in this chapter, you're getting into this steel manning. I feel like this should almost be like a required portion of like any argument or case, to like take the other side and genuinely make it the best case, right? What is it after? And not in a way that has like a faux air of like mocking it at the same time. But no, go on. I just love this chapter, so I wanted to underline that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I there outline 2 of the, I think, most common bits of pushback that you'll get. It's like, well, we need to deal with the issue of incompatible neighbors, and we need to make sure that growth is occurring alongside investments in infrastructure. As I argue in the book, that's actually really important planning work that needs to be done. And to the extent that zoning doesn't actually really accomplish either of those things, or to the extent it accomplishes them in a way that has a whole bunch of other knock-on harms. That's why we need to move on, right? And so, like, this is my overarching sort of thinking in part 3, especially where I'm talking about the case for reform and abolition, is to say, like, land use planning is really important. The current system we have today hasn't gotten us, outputs that we're comfortable with, or that we should be comfortable with, or that reflect our current planning goals. Zoning has sucked the air out of the room on all of these conversations for the past 100 years. What would happen if we just hit the reset button and started to say, what would it look like to really have a fundamental rethink of the way we approach land use planning? And, it's a big picture, project that's going to have to blend theory and practice of planning. But to my mind, like, that's what planning needs to be thinking about, right? Like, of course, in my current capacity at California YIMBY, right, we're very much focused on reform, right? That's the political opening, right? Is you go in and you get rid of the worst aspects of zoning, like minimum parking requirements or apartment prohibitions or really large minimum lot sizes. Those things are totally important, and I don't want to sort of downplay the value of those zoning reforms. But if we're going to put U.S. cities on, much more sort of stable footing for the long term, I think we need a fundamental rethink of the system. One of the concerns I have is we're in this moment, like we're in this moment where there's a lot of reform energy, but what happens when that moment goes away, right? Is the system just going to become as restrictive as it once was? Are these reforms going to meaningfully be locked in?
Book or this is definitely another thing that stood out, and again, coming from this as somebody who was like, if you asked me what zoning was and what it entailed, I would tell you something that made sense, but I didn't quite have the picture that for somebody hearing like zoning, talking about zoning, not doing zoning, I feel like what inhabits the mind first is like, okay, this is interesting, but clearly this is like just a super libertarian kind of person, and I'm wondering, they want to put a junkyard next to my house, or this is about, what I mean? This is about billboards, or like, where is this going? And it was interesting because you kind of broke out, very helpfully, like, what are sort of the real nuisance things that people are concerned about? And you have a list that's like, like noise, smell, light, vibration. There's like, there's this core list of things where people sort of agree, like, of course, but if the coffee shop or the store or the apartment unit doesn't do those things, why does the Lord say they can't exist? Right. So that it sounds subtle, but I think that's really important, because it's not saying like, oh, you can't stop a nuisance, so here's the nuisance next door. It's just saying not all these things have the real nuisances that we care about. So all we're doing is getting the worst parts, but we're missing all this stuff. Right. In fact, your neighbor might have vibrations coming out of their house, even under the current zoning, and you don't want that. So we didn't solve anything. So I don't know if you want to riff on that, but that was very enlightening to me as sort of like an informed layman, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so that's like, again, that's like a sympathetic version of what a lot of zoning is doing, is it's saying, well, we can't regulate nuisance, or we're not going to regulate nuisance in a meaningful way. So let's just put every conceivable land use into categories based on how much of an impact we think they're going to have, and then just segregate them, right? But I think, as you're getting at, right, you can have a bar in a neighborhood, and if you're dealing with the impacts like noise or traffic generation that bother people, what's necessarily the issue, right? I was just in Japan, where they have extremely liberal land use regulations. You commonly see bars in residential neighborhoods. You commonly see light industry, small workshops in residential neighborhoods. But what they do is they regulate very effectively at the margin of the actual impact that those uses can have on neighbors. And so, of course, the impetus to have strict land use segregation just isn't there, right? Now, of course, there are some people who are still going to, for maybe aesthetic reasons or maybe sort of unsavory reasons, don't want certain uses around them. But to my mind, this is where we just have to have a frank conversation of like, what is it actually appropriate for cities to be regulating for, and what is the appropriate basis for segregating uses? I think so much of what zoning is doing is actually just kind of a social project hiding behind the veil of this like good government technocratic intervention. And it's saying like, well, we need to separate junkyards from preschools. Therefore, we're going to adopt this giant code that doesn't allow you to build a duplex next to a mansion, right? I was just in a town in upstate New York, in Caroline, New York, where they're having a big fight over zoning. And it's funny because the pro zoning folks always say like, well, we need to adopt zoning to deal with maybe an Amazon warehouse moving in or a slaughterhouse moving in. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is a town that's not even on a major road, so those uses are almost certainly not coming in. But in the event that they were coming in, how do you deal with that? It's pretty simple, right? You regulate the actual impacts that those potential uses could have. You don't adopt a zoning code, as the zoners were trying to do, that's going to say, we're going to set really high minimum lot sizes, and we're going to not allow you to open, a small little coffee shop on your land fronting along the highway. Like, so much of modern zoning, the way it's framed is it starts from these sort of inoffensive sort of premises, and then it goes on to do so much more and be so much more restrictive than was ever sort of conceived by the typical person who might have said, yeah, sure, zoning makes sense to me.
You mentioned in your book, and I think also because I'm well researched in these conversations. I listened to you on a podcast with I think somebody from the American Planning Association, and they asked you a question of like, it was about how you effectively communicate the idea that zoning that you mentioned that really got me thinking. So when I lived in Detroit, I lived in what's known as, it's called the city's oldest neighborhood. So I'll just take that for a fact, right? It's called Corktown. It was just west of downtown. and clearly has some of the oldest existing residential, buildings in the city. And when I think about that neighborhood, it really did have an interesting mix of like, corners with shops on them and some restaurants tucked into the residential neighborhood. And you brought up that oftentimes, if you think about your own city, some of the most beloved neighborhoods and streets can be the oldest, and the things that people love about them are not legal under current zoning guidelines to ever create again. And I do think that that's sort of like a sobering, that's kind of like a moment of enlightenment in there, where it's like, if you can't recreate your most famous places that you appreciate for their specialness and everybody gets along, that's a really stark, powerful example.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think whenever sort of I'm making this argument to a new audience, I think the assumption, they hear abolish zoning and they think Hong Kong, right? Not that there's anything wrong with Hong Kong, but people imagine like some crazy gross scenario. And realistically, if you want to know what U.S. cities look like without zoning, we have examples of that. It's your typical inner suburb, right? A neighborhood where it's mostly single family homes, but you might have a small apartment building mixed in, or you might have a couple townhouses or a duplex mixed in. You might have a corner grocery or a little corner bar, right? And in many U.S. cities, actually, where these neighborhoods have survived, they're actually some of the most desirable neighborhoods, right? And certainly some of the highest land values on a per square foot basis are found in a lot of these inner suburban neighborhoods that, as you say, are illegal to build today, right? And so that's how I frame these things. I don't talk to people when I'm talking to elected officials who haven't thought about this stuff, or regular people, to the extent that I talk to regular people. I don't talk about FAR or setbacks or heights. I say, let me take you to a neighborhood in this town that would be illegal to build today. And I'm going to ask you, do you think that that's reasonable? And people normally have this visceral reaction of like, oh, well, no, of course. Like for example, my hometown in Lexington, I used to live in a neighborhood called Kenwick, right? It's a neighborhood that's got single family homes mixed in, a few duplexes, a few townhouses, a little corner deli, right? And it's like, it would be illegal to, make outer suburban neighborhoods more like this. And it would be illegal to build this today in most greenfield contexts. And in many ways, it's actually illegal to build a bunch of stuff that's here in this existing neighborhood. And when you put it in those terms, people they get it, right? They're like, okay, this is really weird. We actually don't need all of these rules, and removing all of these rules, the sky's not going to fall. And that's that's a whole other sort of element of this conversation. I talk a little bit about Houston in the book. It's like, like Houston doesn't have zoning, and other sort of mechanisms evolve to deal with a lot of these externalities or land use preferences that people have. But the sky hasn't fallen, right? And it's actually remained one of the more affordable and dynamic cities in the country.
This is tangential and a little bit hyperbolic, but you're somehow reminding me. This was like a random tweet I saw on like whatever, not even stuff I follow, but like, here's a tweet that's doing popular right now, you might like. And it was somebody kind of making a joke. They were like, America built one city that wasn't based around the automobile and had like dense mixed use. It quickly became the world's cultural and economic capital. And then we decided to never build another one. It was basically a joke about like, Manhattan, essentially. And of course people argued like, oh, there's tons of cars there, whatever, but along the same lines, it was just sort of amusing. It was like, how do you not, how are you effectively not allowed to like this stuff or build the stuff that people like? I don't know.
Well, and a crazy element of it is like, not only, we actually built a lot of Manhattans, right? Like you look at, for example, in the region you're at, you look at Detroit and Milwaukee, right? Like these cities actually had like areas that were almost Manhattan level density. Certainly, almost every American city had large portions of the city were relatively dense, mixture of land uses, walkable, had decent transit. And then over the last like 70 years, concurrent to zoning codes that made those cities illegal, we just destroyed them, right? As a matter of not by accident, like explicit policy of let's like destroy all but one of these like cities that we have, right? And it's a crazy history. And I mean, this touches on like why I write the book is that another thing we were talking about is I find that people just aren't even aware of this history, and they're not aware of that these rules, and they're not aware that like policy that maybe they read about in history books that destroyed our cities. They're not even aware that that's still policy, right? Like that still happens.
Well, let me ask you on this front, because I don't think so. So being in the data world and knowing how important data is, but I also have no illusions. Like, I think people inform themselves through narratives and stories, which is why your book I think is so important and well told. But the stories, those like yourself who take the time to tell the stories, they tell them best when they're underpinned by like real data about the world. We had chatted about this some previously, but like zoning data, like actually like seeing across the country how every municipality is zoned is really, really darn hard, right? Because again, everything's done at this local level, and then there's no real standardization, right? I mean, you have similar categories and theme and variation, but you know, when you're talking about local zoning codes for a small community that might have their own unique codes with, you know, 100 pages of kind of exposition about you know, what they actually mean and what you can do. Like, talk to me a minute about just like how does one understand what zoning is across the U.S. right now? Like, what are the right sources? Who's working on this in an interesting way? How do you get enlightened on that data perspective?
Well, it's tough. I mean, yeah, as I was saying earlier, right? Like a unique feature of the US system is that zoning almost varies completely jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? Like there are broad similarities, broad contours, but you have a huge amount of variation. So this is tough, right? Like there are a few different groups that are trying to do statewide zoning atlases. So Connecticut, Desegregate Connecticut put one of these together for Connecticut. Frontier Institute of Montana put together a statewide zoning map for Montana. And, you know, putting different zoning districts broadly into the same category so you could actually do a little bit of comparison. But it's tough, right? I mean, it's really hard. This is as you know, research director at California IMBY, this is one of our biggest challenges is that we don't have statewide zoning data. And then even if we did, it's kind of hard to draw comparisons between jurisdictions. You know, I'm sure that this is similar to in the land titling world as well. But another issue is you have the rules that are written on the books, and then you have the way that things actually happen in the real world, and those don't line up perfectly, right? So even if you had a zoning map and you even could even draw broad comparisons between what R1 means in one city and another, there might be all this stuff lurking in the background of norms and, you know, relationships that actually define how things happen. So I would say, right, the best way to understand zoning is to try to understand one zoning code, right? Like try to understand, pick a city, pick your city where you live, right? And try to understand, you know, what's going on in this code. What are the main components of it? If you understand one code very well, right, then you can generally extrapolate about other cities. You know, of course, giant asterisks there, right? Like I was a city planner in New York, and I would consider myself highly knowledgeable about the New York City zoning code. But I moved out to LA, and it's like, yeah, I know the broad contours of how the system works, but I definitely could not tell you any details about LA zoning because I just haven't intensively dived into it. But so there is value. I would say the way to learn about it is to learn about one particular zoning system and become an expert on that. And then you can branch out from there. It's tough though. It's a tough research space.
And you got me thinking. I mean, this is just a funny thing to say, but like, you know, with Regrid and the nationwide parcel data, we gather and provide like lots of like broad zoning columns, and by broad zoning columns, I'm meaning like B12, R4. Like we can tell you like that code, which you can kind of generally infer like there's something residentially here going on, right? But it won't be immediately obvious without digging a little bit deeper. Okay, these are like detached single family homes. This is like there's some mixed use apartment complexes in here. Like that's the work where you've really got to go that level down to unpack it, right? Like, so for this particular code, this is the real land use, the allowance, this is the size of the building, this is the offset, all this kind of stuff. And I will confess that your book got me thinking about this in kind of a weird way, where I was like, you know, I know the power of maps. Like when people see something on a map or they get it in the data set, they're like, okay, this is like reality. And so I've been kind of like thinking about like, how could one collect and provide like a zoning data set along with the context that like, this is real, but it might not be real. And it might not be the way that it should be. So like, if you want to do something here, you should probably also connect with whoever controls this stuff locally to figure out if it can change. And it almost seemed like, it was, okay, I'll just try to compare this. If you're dealing in the world of property lines and ownership, it seems very far-fetched to me that anybody could go to a municipality and be like, I would like that property to be mine, and I would like the lines to be different. That just feels like that's a very, 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 very third rail, right? Like you just couldn't do it. Zoning seems to have kind of another thing going on. Like they come from laws, they're things that need to be followed, but the whole vibe on it, like we talked a little bit about like developer friendliness and like just some communities being more receptive for like, yeah, tell us what you want to do. Or like, you know what I mean? Or like, we're actually open to changing this. it's really, really hard to tell from a distance. And so it's almost got me thinking about, I don't know if ethics are the right terms, but like the effectiveness of like, rather than showing like, this is what it is right here, how do you sort of like build some enthusiasm for like, these have been the guidelines, but like, this is open for rethinking, or, you know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
worth talking to Brian or Sue, you know, to see if they're like, oh, hell, it says 10 feet tall, but it's a cool idea. We can do. So I don't know how you try to ferret these things out.
Yeah. Well, just very quickly, I have to hop here in a couple minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I mean it's tough, right? I mean that's why I wanted to center the arbitrary nature of a lot of these rules, right? And that's why it's in the title. It's like I think there is this notion that these rules, right? Well, let me step back for a minute, right? I think that there are a lot of sort of elements of zoning that make it sound very scientific, right? Like floor area ratios, right, or parking ratios, or they make it sound like there's a health and safety basis, right? Like a minimum lot size or minimum unit sizes. But in reality, a lot of these standards are fairly arbitrary. And I think that the more that we can help folks appreciate that these are purely social constructions, minimum lot size, minimum unit size don't actually have any basis in health and safety. The health and safety considerations are covered by county, septic and water regulators, right? Minimum unit size is dealt with by building code. And then, of course, floor area ratio might sound scientific, but it's just purely an arbitrary number saying you get to build this much floor area because you have a lot that's this big. So I think that is important to center. You raise an interesting point, though, which is the problem of assembling this type of data, right? And sometimes, right, like even just the stuff on the books might be misleading. I think I gave an example in my book of, I think it's from Lexington, R3 or R4, and it's literally called high density apartments or something like that. Yeah. And like, it's like 50% lot coverage and like 3 stories max. And you're like, well, if you read high density apartments, you would probably think something very different from what that zoning district actually allows. So that's a challenge. And then of course, as you mentioned, right, like, yeah, all these rules might be on the books, but you can go and negotiate and maybe get, more or less what you want to build. Of course, those are, that's a kludge, right? That's a kludge for dealing with a broken system that doesn't reflect reality. Is we say, well, let's just add a bunch of exceptions in. And that's how zoning works in your typical city today. Is almost every project is going to require a variance or a special permit or, a rezoning, some relief from the zoning as it exists today because the developer can't actually build anything that needs to be built. And then, of course, this is going to make every single new project political, right? It politicizes development. It rewards developers who can get in and play, the game of politics or hire the right attorney or hire the right local planner. Pay off the right local community group. And I think that's another element of zoning that I think is deeply unhealthy is even where like we have mechanisms that provide relief from these bad rules, then that gets you sort of other bad alternative kludge, workaround systems that have their own issues. And this is a bit of pushback I get every now and then. It's like I'll be talking to a local planner and I'll say, hey, your planning code has parking requirements don't actually allow you to build apartments on all of these lots, or don't actually allow you to have somebody lease out one of these commercial spaces on your main street. And they always say, oh, well, we'll give out a variance to anybody who wants a variance. Like, yeah, that's the rule on the book, but if they come and ask us, we'll give them a variance. And it's like, well, like if the rule is bad, then it shouldn't be the rule in the first place, right? Like if that like you're going to like have all of these variance requests coming in, just remove the rule and don't have it be this thing where a person has to incur all of these additional costs and delays to get something built.
Well, Nolan, I know you got to hop in a minute here. Really appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to say real quick about stuff that you're working on right now? Or I know sounds like you've got, I didn't see your YouTube, but it sounds like you've got like a YouTube channel you do too. You've got a podcast, you write books, you're with California YIMBY, you sing and dance. I don't know, what's good?
Well, right now, the bulk of my attention is focused on California YIMBY. I'm research director there. We're an organization that changes laws in California to make it easier to build housing. And we've had a lot of successes in the last few years, and we're trying to double down on that. Part of doing that work is I'm trying to help other groups in other states sort of learn from our successes and learn from our mistakes, and hopefully spread this pro housing land use reform moment to other places. So that's been really exciting. And we have a new podcast, Abundance Podcast, where I'll be talking to folks every other week. And no books quite yet. I don't know that I'm ready to get back on the book treadmill just yet, but Stay tuned.
another time I want to pick your brain on process, but hopefully we can send a few more fans your way. You've got one here for sure. Just really appreciate what you do. It sounds like you're getting a lot of love from this book, and I just hopefully you're feeling it, because I imagine it gets lonely doing this stuff sometimes. You feel like a broken record, because you say the same things and you hear yourself, but everyone who's hearing this stuff most people are hearing it for the first time, and it's meaningful. So thank you.
It's so funny that you say that, because when like I've said, I've been on book tour for the past 6 months or so, but I took January off, and it's kicking back up now in February. And I was thinking, like, man, am I crazy? Like, this is just such a crazy, because I'm one or two different towns every week meeting with the YIMBY group. And, it's draining, right? It's tired. Travel is tough. And, I'm thinking to myself, am I just crazy to do this? Why am I doing this? But, every time I go to one of these towns, and it's like, I'm making people realize, like, hey, you're not in the wilderness. Like, you're part of something much bigger, and this is an important thing to be working on, and you all are on the right track, and keep pushing, and you're not alone. It's totally worth it. And, to the extent that I can play a small role in being a cheerleader for all of the reform efforts that are happening across the country, it's totally worth it. I tend to think that, like, we have windows of opportunity for reform on stuff, and these moments come and go, and can't take it for granted. So hopefully 10 years down the line, we'll be able to look back and say, wow, okay, like, we actually translated a lot of these really big ideas into meaningful policy changes.
Amen. And I'm sure your crowd work is on point after that many conversations with people too. You get good at the, whatever, the joust and the one-liners and stuff. So use that talent that you've been building up here.
You can only embarrass yourself so many times.
Well, I'm testing that, but so thank you, Nolan. I'll